Welcome to Write Now with Scrivener, where writers talk about how they work, how they develop their ideas, and how they use Scrivener, the app built for long-form writing projects. I'm your host, Kirk McElhearn, author of Take Control of Scrivener. Today I'm very happy to welcome Kate Heartfield. Kate is a fantasy author who writes historical fantasy and has written novels based on video games and interactive fiction, and it's quite a portfolio. Kate, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
You've had a long career, and just before we started recording, we talked about the number of books that you've written, and they kind of creep up on you after a while, don't they? How many have you written so far?
I have 3 novels of my own work out, and a couple of novellas, and a couple of Assassin's Creed tie-in novels.
Plus the interactive fiction games, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have 2 interactive fiction projects that are about novel length. One could say the playthroughs are about novella length each one, but the actual word count is the size of a big novel.
Okay, we'll talk about that later. You started as a journalist, and what kind of journalism did you do?
So I was in opinion writing for the most part. I went to journalism school here in Ottawa, Canada, around the turn of the century, and got my Master of Journalism there. And I freelanced for a few years and did various things, magazine pieces and, whatever I could get as a freelancer, as a young freelancer at the time. And then I started writing columns for my local newspaper, opinion columns on just local issues. And eventually that evolved into a full-time job at the newspaper, and I was there for 11 years. I was the opinion editor when I left in 2015.
And how did you switch to fiction? Had you been writing fiction on the side all along, or did it grab you as you were writing journalism and you realized that there's often a fine line between journalism and fiction, isn't there?
Yeah, definitely. I had written fiction all along. I'm one of those people who has been a fiction writer since I was a kid. And I wrote at 11 o'clock at night when I had the full-time newspaper job and a kid and all the rest of it. I just found time. I would take a few years off from time to time, but for the most part, I've always written fiction. But I did start to publish more around the time that I left journalism. And one of the reasons that I left was to have more time for fiction. So these days, I'm about half and half. I do about half of my income and half of my time comes from fiction. And the rest of it is as a freelance nonfiction writer and as a teacher.
How do you find switching the mindset from the journalism to the fiction? Do you have days for journalism and days for fiction, or half days for each? How do you do that?
It's a bit chaotic in my schedule. I tend to focus anything that needs a lot of brain time. I do when my kid is at school and when the hours are more quiet. So I don't necessarily divide things based on whether it's journalism or fiction. But there are different approaches for sure. And I think there are some things that are similar between them. I think in a lot of cases, I have some of the same concerns. I'm thinking about how did society get here? How did humanity get to this place? And where do we go next? And so in some ways, they're not that different. But a lot of the tools and structures, of course, are different. And the ways of using your creative brain can be a little bit different, too.
I would be worried that one would influence the other, and I'd be worried more that the fiction influences the journalism than the other way around. Does that happen?
Not really. I think with journalism, because I have such good habits, that have built up over time, and I just know how to do it. And it's very formulaic is not the right word necessarily, but I have a scaffolding, that I just return to all the time. And I have ethics, and I have ideas about storytelling that are very journalism specific. Whereas with fiction, it's more the sky's the limit, and so I can be a little bit more creative and think about different ways of telling the story. And I don't really bring that back the other way around that much. I'm not someone who writes a lot of, what we used to call creative nonfiction. I suppose people still do, or new wave journalism, that was never my style. I was always writing a much more straightforward, explanatory or persuasive essays and reviews and reporting and that kind of thing. So I haven't found that to be an issue. I think it's probably been more of an issue the other way, in that I do have to remind myself to loosen up with my prose and think more about word choices in different ways when I'm writing fiction. because I got so used to sort of subject verb object sentences, writing journalism and clarity above all when writing journalism. And that's not always the case with fiction.
Yeah, it's true that there's a sort of a balance between the two. And on the one hand, journalism, you're writing for the web, so you don't have as much fixed word count as you do when you were writing for print, right? But you still have to be concise. You can't go 3,000 words when something can be told in 1,000 words, whereas in fiction, you can go as long as you want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and sometimes you need to go longer. And in fact, that's an issue I frequently have with fiction is that I will start with a really skeletal draft and I have to add to it as I go. I'm not one of those people who cuts from draft to draft. And I think part of that is my journalistic training, that I've trained myself to write in as few words as possible. And then with fiction, sometimes to build tension and to have emotion and bring the reader into the piece, longer work is actually better paced for that. And so that's, I've learned that about my process now, is that my first draft is probably about 75% as long as the final draft will be.
That's interesting because Stephen King famously says in his book on writing that the second draft should be 20% shorter than the first draft.
Yeah, I know. And when I was starting out, I would read, a lot of people give that advice, and it's good advice in certain ways. It's really good to think about economy of language and to look for extraneous words and all the rest of it, and for scenes that are not doing a good job in the story and all of that. But the sort of overall advice to just make something shorter in a sort of global way does not apply to all writers. And that's true of all writing advice, is that no piece of advice is going to work for everybody.
Yeah, you may be adding a new character in the second draft.
Right.
And so that's several chapters and a lot of revisions. Mm-hmm. I don't like these, like they say, kill your darlings. Like, if you've written a really good sentence, get rid of it. What's the point of writing good sentences if you're going to just get rid of them? So all of these so-called rules only apply to certain people in certain situations. And I guess I'm thinking the way Stephen King must write, he must write fat, mm-hmm. would be the best way to say mm-hmm. it. And he's got to trim that when he gets finished. But a lot of other writers, they have a more creative approach, and they're adding things as they go on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It's just a different way of writing yourself into the story. I had a journalism prof who used to call it writing your way into coherence. And if you're sort of telling yourself the story and you need a lot of words to explain it to yourself as you're going in the first draft, then yeah, you'll end up with a lot of padding at the end. But I think my brain is working slightly differently, and it is more of a framework that I'm developing in the early draft. And then I put some meat on those bones to mix the metaphors.
That's a good way to say it, though, because a lot of first drafts, and then there's the people who say, all first drafts are crap, but a lot of first drafts are that structure that you're filling in on the second draft. I want to talk about some of your writing. You write historical fantasy, and this is interesting because a lot of fantasy is, for want of a better term, totally made up fantasy. But when you're writing historical fantasy, and I wonder if this is related to your journalism experience, you're writing around real events that exist. So a recent book you wrote is The Embroidered Book, which is a historical fantasy about Marie Antoinette in the 18th century. And did you find it easier to have this skeleton of truth that you could add, that you could embroider to, that you could add to in telling a fantasy story?
Yeah, it was easier in some ways. I really like doing that, telling a story that's in amongst the real facts of history, that uses the real facts of history as a scaffolding and then fills in some secret knowledge in between those facts. So I find that really fun, and it's a way of, I suppose it does give me touch points along the way, or sort of milestones to hit, so that I have a structure that I can start with, and then I can work with that and change it in a way that suits the story that I'm trying to tell. In other ways, of course, it also does make it more difficult, because if you get to a point in the story where you think, oh, actually, for character arc purposes, I need something else to happen. Well, if you've already committed to telling a story that is not going to deviate from history, you've got to be really creative in how you find a way to do that without actually departing from those facts. So it's really similar to sort of straightforward historical fiction, like Hilary Mantel's kind of books, in that way, is that you're still telling a character story within those facts. And so you've got to find a way to work within that, which can be a challenge.
Yeah, you can't change the history, because you'll have that person who's read every biography of Marie Antoinette who points out that no, it wasn't this, it was that, and gives you bad reviews on Amazon and Goodreads and all of that. So you have to be true to the history. How much research did you do for that? Because you've got to research the character, you've got to research the whole court in Versailles and France in the 18th century. This is a vast topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. And it was, it took a lot of research. I also have another character who is in Naples at the time, and a little bit of the Habsburg court in Austria. So it takes place over a few decades. So it is, I did bite off a lot with that book for sure. And the research, it was, the problem with that particular book is that there's so much information about Marie Antoinette that there's so many books about her. I have 3 books just about her clothing, so, it was not, sometimes you're writing a book and the issue is you can't find enough sources. And sometimes it's the opposite problem where I could have written my PhD on her and still would not have known everything. So at some point you just have to say, okay, I know enough to go forward. I know enough to tell my story or to have a conception of the character that I want to tell. And then as you go through, if you realize that you need to know something more about the clothing or the food or which particular palace they would be at a given time of year or whatever it is, then you have the books on your shelf to just look that up, or you know how to find them at the library, or you know how to find them online. So it's sort of getting a base that you can work with, but not trying to know everything and have everything in binders and notebooks, because I think that would just take decades.
Marie Antoinette is a pretty popular character in recent years. There was a film with Kirsten Dunst. There was a TV series 2 years ago. I don't know if it reached Canada, but it was on the BBC. Does that influence you? Does that frustrate you because it gives an image of the character that's different from the image that you've developed in the novel?
Again, it was sort of it had its pros and cons, So I really love that Kirsten Dunst movie, the Sofia Coppola Marie Antoinette movie, and I think it influenced my book in some ways in terms of the conception of the character, and also because that movie was based on Antonia Fraser's biography, which was also kind of my Bible for my novel as well. It was
right.
The biography that I kept going back to. I never found an error in that book. It was just beautifully written and beautifully researched. So I think in some ways that lineage was really helpful for me, that I had a conception of the character to start with. And I had, there was an example of how to deal with that character in a somewhat sympathetic way, not letting her off the hook, but understanding some more of the context, which we hadn't really seen in previous 20th century film versions of her, that, they were not, they were caricatures, before that. And so I think that was helpful to me in some way. The frustrating part of it does come from knowing that every reader is going to come into this book with an idea of who this person is. And so you've got to deal with that without breaking the suspension of disbelief or whatever the voice, the deal that the author is making with the reader. So, for example, things like the famous line, "Let them eat cake," and that some readers are not going to recognize that is actually a myth, that there's no evidence of her actually saying that. And in fact, it's very likely that she did not say that. And so you've got to deal with that without actually coming out and breaking the fourth wall and saying, by the way, she never said that. You could make that choice if you wanted and to have a foreword or whatever. But there are little challenges like that come with writing about a character with a historical figure who is already so well known and who has this agglomeration of facts and opinions and cartoons and everything else around her, half of which are not really based on fact.
Okay, we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk more about the embroidered book and then your latest novel, The Valkyrie, and how you use Scrivener. Writing a book, screenplay, or even a long article is a juggling act. You need to find the right words and the right structure, keep track of research, and refer to notes. Tailor-made for long writing projects, Scrivener is the go-to app for writers of all types. Scrivener combines a typewriter, binder, and corkboard in a single app. A project outline makes it easy to get an overview of your work and flip between sections. Refer to research alongside your writing and just drag and drop to rearrange your work. Write in any order in sections as large or small as you like and let Scrivener stitch it all together when you're ready to share your words with the world. With Scrivener, you'll find everything you need to start writing and keep writing. Scrivener is available for Mac, Windows, iPad, and iPhone. Download the free trial from scrivenerapp.com. Right now, with Scrivener listeners can get a 20% discount with the coupon code PODCAST. That's scrivenerapp.com. I just want to return to something you said about Marie Antoinette, because not only did she not say let them eat cake, but the word in that sentence is not cake, it's brioche. It's qu'ils mangent de la brioche, let them eat brioche. Now, I guess brioche was cake-ish, but we understand cake is something with icing, right? And brioche is just a bread with eggs. I know it's a tiny little thing, but anything in translation gets a little twisted when there's not a perfect correspondence between the two things. Like if you talk about bread in Canada, the US, or England, it's one thing. If you talk about bread in France, it's a baguette.
Yeah, absolutely. And things like that are, daily minefields, I think, for a historical fiction writer, trying to convey the truth of something to a reader that you have never met, and you don't know where that reader is coming from. You don't know what country they're living in or how old they are or what century even they might be reading your book in. So that is a challenge. And the way I try to look at it is to be as honest as I possibly can be and just make the closest attempt at a truth that I can, which I suppose gets back to the connection to journalism. But of course, you're coming at it with a different toolkit as a fiction writer. And I really love when I get emails from people saying, the embroidered book sent me to Wikipedia for 3 hours, because to me, that's the beginning of learning more about the subject. And my novel is certainly not the final word on truth and fact about the subject. So I'm glad for it to be a stepping stone for people to learn more about something. And I think about things like the musical Hamilton, which of course is not completely historically accurate and has been criticized in many ways. And there are big and small changes to history that Lin-Manuel Miranda made. But as a Canadian who didn't know very much about Alexander Hamilton, I can tell you I know a heck of a lot more now, So I think it does actually serve history, I think, in that way.
I think a lot of people read historical fiction to learn about history, don't they?
Yeah, a lot of people do. It's accessible, and it's maybe not as daunting as picking up a nonfiction book.
So your latest novel is The Valkyrie, which is a retelling of Norse mythology. That's 90 degrees, 180 degrees away from Marie Antoinette. How did you pick this topic?
Yeah, that one was, it came to me as I was reading bedtime stories to my kid, and he was about 8 or 9 years old at the time, and I was reading some Norse mythology books to him. And of course, I had read mythology when I was younger as well, and fairy tales, and had always been interested in it. And I came across the story of Brunhild and Sigurd, or Siegfried, as he's called in the Germanic versions. And there were elements of the story that I thought, I think Brunhild would tell it differently if someone could ask her. If you could interview her today, what would she say about this story? And that was the spark. I thought, well, I feel like there's something behind this story that has been told and told and retold. And, it became an opera cycle by Wagner, and it's become a Bugs Bunny cartoon. And, it's been so changed over time, so it's the story of the Valkyrie and Sigurd, the Dragon Slayer, has come down in so many variations and versions. And to that extent, I think it was not so different than writing about Marie Antoinette, because that idea of a story that has been retold and retold and retold and maybe doesn't have as much fact in it as it once did, was appealing to me to think about, well, what if I stripped away some of those layers and looked at the story again, very much through a 21st century lens, but thinking about what lay at the heart of it for me and what was interesting about the story for me. And originally these stories about the dragon Fafnir and the Valkyrie Brunhild, they were historical fiction about an empire in a time of transition, the Roman Empire in a time of transition, and Attila the Hun coming in, and what was happening to the little client kingdoms on the edges of the empire. And those seeds of history are still there in the old medieval manuscripts. So that appealed to me as someone who writes about historical fantasy, to look back at the historical roots and also to examine some of the roots of modern fantasy that are in those stories.
Yeah, it's a good point because modern fantasy comes from stories as much Beowulf and the Valkyrie legends and all of that. And when you were saying the story told by Brunhild made me think of John Gardner's book Grendel, where he's telling the Beowulf story from Grendel's point of view.
Yeah.
And you have all these options in these well-known old stories to flip that point of view.
Yeah, John Gardner is such a formative writer for me, and Grendel in particular. And that way of using a retelling to shift the perspective on a story and to ask ourselves, well, how has this story affected the way we see ourselves and philosophy and religion and everything else? Because stories are a part of that. So I think that's one of the reasons to do a retelling, is to examine some of our own assumptions and some of the things we've been taught through these stories. And Grendel is a wonderful example of that.
Okay, I want to talk about how you use Scrivener. First of all, do you use Scrivener for your journalistic writing?
I don't. I tend to use it for longer projects. So anything that is less than 20 pages or so, or 10,000 words or so, I will use usually either Word or Google Docs or something like that. A
lot of people do use Scrivener for short writing, just organizing it in folders to keep it together, just to have a familiar environment.
Yeah, I could. And I think part of the reason that I haven't is just because in recent years, I've been working a lot with organizations that have their own ways of doing things. So if I had my druthers and I could choose my own, platforms for writing things in, then I might do that for sure. But yeah, so often I tend to be working in whatever the organization is using for collaborative work. And sometimes those are different sort of proprietary platforms and stuff too. But definitely if I'm writing my own work, especially anything of any length, then going back to about 2012, I've been using Scrivener.
So I can imagine your Scrivener projects, assuming you put a lot of research in the Scrivener project, they must be quite large, because the amount of research you had about Marie Antoinette is, it's endless, and the same about the Valkyrie story. You could just keep adding research forever. How do you manage to organize that, but also manage to stop doing research after a while?
Yeah, I do. I use Scrivener for a sort of a hub for all of my research, for sure. So I will have, in the research folder, I will have just a bunch of text documents that are things like my running bibliography and links to sources and interesting web pages. And also I will write myself copious notes that all go into Scrivener as well. I can't write by hand without my hand cramping up, so I am not a notebook person. So Scrivener is definitely my notebook as well as my drafting area. It will, the stopping research at a certain point, it does help to have that kind of two-pronged approach that I talk about with starting out and getting a base knowledge and then leaving some of the details for as you go along, because you can't know until you start writing what tiny details of a military uniform or something like that you might need to know later. So I will, leave some of those details for as I'm writing, or even I'll put a bracket into my my manuscript and say, I'll come back to this later and fill in the blank if it's something small. So that's kind of how I approach that problem of the possibility of endless rabbit holes of research.
So how do you use Scrivener when you're writing your novels? Do you start at the beginning? Do you start in the middle? Do you outline?
I do outline. I tend to actually work more with a synopsis than an outline, in the sense that I learned that a bullet point outline, or point form, as we say in Canada, is not that useful for me because it doesn't have the connective tissue of storytelling in it. It doesn't have the because and therefores and thens, whereas a synopsis is a story, even if it is a short and kind of boring story. And it has the logic of a story behind it because it's got to be written in complete sentences and with all of that connective tissue. So what I tend to do now is I will write myself a synopsis, typically 1 or 2 pages. Once I have all my notes about character arcs and the basic beats that I want to hit in the story, I'll write it as a synopsis. And then I'll keep that running synopsis in in Scrivener in one of my documents in the research folder. And the reason I call it a running synopsis is because I am the kind of person that changes as I go. So as I'm working on the draft.
But that makes sense. The novel evolves as you're writing it. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's always just a sort of blueprint, and then it'll change as I go. And so I'll keep making changes to just keep myself aware of what story is happening. And I write in a very linear fashion, typically. So I will start at the beginning, but I'm also the kind of person who's always reshaping the clay on the wheel as I go, and I will revise as I go, and then I'll revise later. I revise a lot. And the one really interesting way that I use Scrivener now is to help me with my timeline. So I now have it integrated into Eon Timeline, which allows me to put metadata in Scrivener that will then appear in Eon Timeline. And that helps me a lot, because one thing I have found as someone with writing historical fiction, and also as a reviser who changes as I go, is I end up with my character ages being wrong, or I end up with some sort of continuity error at the end. And copy editors have rescued me from myself multiple times. And I'm very careful. And as a former journalist, I have rescued myself many times as well. But there's always something that seems to get through to the penultimate draft, at least. And then a copy editor finds it, or a proofreader finds it, and, bless them. But I do find that using Scrivener really deliberately now to tie into all of my note taking and my timelines is really helpful, because that way, if I change anything in the document, I'm immediately going to change it in all of my notes. Whereas when I used to just have a separate spreadsheet or something somewhere for my timeline, I might not always think to change it as I'm revising. And that was where I got into problems.
That makes sense, because when you are dealing with historical characters, and if I understand correctly, in the embroidered book, you said several locations. So something's going on in Paris and something's going on in Austria and another place, and you have to make sure that they all make sense.
Yeah. And, if you were the kind of person that wrote an outline that was a perfect template, and then you just filled it in like doing paint by numbers and never revised it, or nothing ever changed, then I think it's possible you could hold all of that in your head and not create continuity problems for yourself. But as I'm not that kind of writer, I have to be aware as I go of changes that I'm making. And the next novel I have coming out is called The Tapestry of Time, and it's about the Second World War. It mostly takes place in 1944. And that history is so well documented. Every day we know exactly what happened and where people were. And there's not a lot of room for, maybe this happened, So the closer you get in history, it's even more tricky to make sure that everything is correct.
Is this a fantasy novel as well?
It is, yeah.
Is that 1944, around World War II? Yeah.
It's about 4 clairvoyant sisters in 1944, and they are involved in a struggle with the Nazis to find and control the Bayeux Tapestry, which really happened, but of course without clairvoyance, as far as we know.
Yeah, you can go visit the Bayeux Tapestry in Bayeux, actually. I've seen it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Himmler did not get it and did not put it into his castle, but not for lack of trying.
Good. It's a good thing, because it's an amazing work of art. Did you go to see it?
No, I've never seen it. I've never seen it in person. So I've been to France, but I haven't been there.
It's very impressive, because it's, 35 meters long or something? Mm-hmm. And it's in this dark room behind glass, and it's on 3 walls, and you walk through and you live the story as you walk through. It's not like a comic strip. It's a unique design. I'm sure you've seen the images of it.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But if you get a chance, you should go see it. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, I would love to. So, yeah, next trip to France, I'm going for sure.
Okay, I like to ask my guests if they have a book they'd like to recommend to our listeners, maybe something you've read recently, or maybe one of your favorite books.
Yeah, so I will say my favorite book that I've read in the last year or so is The Saint of Bright Doors by Vajra Chandrasekhara, who is a Sri Lankan writer, and this is his first novel. And I've read his short fiction in the past, and so I was eagerly anticipating this novel, and I was not disappointed. And it was really, it's a unique fantasy novel, unusual in many ways. It tells a story. It's set in a place where it's very similar to our world in many ways, in the sense of the technological level and the just bonkers politics that is our own world, and a struggle between authoritarian and democratic concepts of forming a society. But it's also examining and subverting tropes about the chosen one and other sort of fantastical world building that we've all gotten used to. So I highly recommend The Saint of Bright Doors. If you haven't read it yet, anyone out there, do pick it up. And he's got another one coming out later this year called Rakes Fall. So check that one out too.
Okay, Kate Heartfield, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
If you like the podcast, please follow it in iTunes or your favorite podcast app. To learn more about Scrivener, go to scrivenerapp.com. Join us next month for another conversation on Right Now with Scrivener.